And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Welcome to the Republic for the United States of America. You may call me Kelby. I am an American. Today is the 14th of April, 2016. Tonight's RNN featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. The RNN, which stands for Republic News Network, has been doing these calls for about 6 years and has always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. It's true. The United States is a federal corporation. Their exclusive jurisdiction is in the District of Columbia, and you can find this information under Title 28, Section 3002 and UCC 9-307H. The Republic government was just a bunch of U.S. citizens that realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders intended. We've been hard at work now for 8 years and have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government. You can consider the Republic members are simply tired of all that corruption we see every day. See, we found in the law that there is, in fact, two forms of government here on our land, and we did something about it. We are people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too can be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to the Republic for the United States of America. Please bow your head. Father God, we want to thank you for the opportunity to hear truth and hear other people's opinions. Lord, bless this call. Bless the people that are on it. Guide us, Lord, in directing us in the proper way that you would like us to re-inhabit this country successfully back to where it was, to be under you, where we are self-governed. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Mr. Dan Happel, I yield the floor.
Thank you, Kelby, and I want to welcome our guests to the program tonight. I believe we're going to have a terrific program. We've got two guests on our show tonight that are really outstanding individuals that have worked very hard to expose the truth of what's been happening with the environmental movement, with the introduction of endangered species that may or may not be endangered, and also the way our government has manipulated those facts to create the kind of a situation that we're moving into today, and that is toward a loss of property rights and individual rights under our Constitution, and a movement into a one-world socialist government. I will start this conversation with just a brief history of what happened that led up to this, and I'm not going to go all the way back, but I will go back to 1992, the Earth Summit. That was signed by George Herbert Walker Bush. It was the document that was created from that Earth Summit was what we know today as UN Agenda 21. In 1994, President Clinton, a newly elected President Clinton, implemented the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And under that, many new programs were implemented through cabinet-level agencies that promoted Agenda 21 policies that had been outlined at Rio de Janeiro. Under that program, a lot of radical environmental groups assigned NGO status as sanctioned UN affiliates are given a seat at the table in federal agencies such as the Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Services, and on ad infinitum. Earth First, widely recognized as an eco-terrorist group founder, David Foreman, promotes the reintroduction of large predators, and rather than being held accountable as an eco-terrorist, we started to adopt those policies. So that led to the transfer of 15 breeding pairs of Canadian gray wolves to Yellowstone Park despite strong public opposition. I would bring this out with our first guest would be Jim Beers. Jim is a retired fish and wildlife biologist that has quite a history with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he was the gentleman that turned state's evidence, became a whistleblower to expose the fact that the Pittman-Robertson Fund had been used to pay for the transfer of these gray wolves from Canada into the United States. So that being said, Jim, would you like to give a kind of a brief bio to expand on that, and then let's talk about how that act happened.
Certainly, Dan. I was a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service after I got out of the Navy. It was in 1969. And by 1972, 72, 73, I had worked as a law enforcement officer in the Dakotas, out of Minnesota, in New York City. And I had been a wetlands biologist in North Dakota. And then I went in 73 into Washington, D.C. And I wound up spending the next 30 years in Washington as a congressional fellow, wildlife biologist, and endangered species biologist, congressional fellow, whatever. And I just happened to, by luck and the draw, been in Washington from the advent of those new laws, the Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Wilderness Act, the Animal Welfare Act, all of those new laws that were passed, and how the bureaucracies took hold of them and made use of them and changed the entire workforce of the federal bureaucracy, and just changed the bureaucracy's goals and the reasons for which all this land had been set aside for national forests and national refuges. They had turned that on its head with people that were actually, I guess you could say, hateful of or opposed to what had gone on in the federal government for the previous 50 years and all of the purposes of the programs and conservation biology and everything. And I just happened to be there as that all changed, and for reasons that would take quite a while to go into, they tried to force me to retire or to fire me for no reason in the late 1990s, and because of the way they handled that, I wound up at home alone and was asked to go up to explain to Congress why I was at home on a government salary with benefits and everything else and not having any work to do. And one thing led to another, and I wound up helping perform an audit with the General Accounting Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that exposed $45 to $60 million that had been diverted in the middle of the Clinton administration by Clinton appointees and managers in the Fish and Wildlife Service. They had stolen the money from funds that were earmarked for state wildlife programs and then used it primarily to capture those wolves in Canada, to transport them into the United States without making out the documents at the entry points in the northern border from Canada. So we don't know exactly where they came from or anything else because the federal government just ignored something that if they caught you or me doing it, they'd put us in jail for and give terrible fines and everything else. They took them into Yellowstone, acclimatized them for a short period, and then kicked them loose, and with the purpose that they would spread all over the upper Rockies, which they have. And in the meantime, the introduction of those wolves, the Fish and Wildlife Service had asked for money from Congress and authorization to do that just at the end of the Bush administration, the beginning of the the Clinton administration, and Congress said no. They did not give them the money, nor did they authorize it. But the Fish and Wildlife Service managers, including one that had just lost a job up on Congressional Hill up there, that had worked for a congressional committee, he was a Democrat appointee, and he was given a job in the Fish and Wildlife Service to oversee those very funds. Well, anyway, they spent them. They put the wolves in there. The wolves got loose. And to be honest with you, even though there was enormous publicity in the newspapers, packed hearing rooms and everything else, nobody was ever held accountable. And among other giant surprises, the directors of the state fish and wildlife agencies, from whom $60 million in a period of a couple of years had been stolen from the wildlife programs for you and me. Those fish and wildlife directors decided in their lobby group in Washington that they would not ask for that money to be replaced because they were suddenly so involved with the federal government and the Fish and Wildlife Service for grants and for jobs and everything else that they turned into what amount to, even today, even more so, sort of subcontractors for a whole host of federal programs and federal goals and agendas that are just destroying wildlife and state authority and everything else. So I just happened to be there at the right time as a bureaucrat, and I happen to be a wildlife biologist. So since I left the government, I've tried real hard to talk to people about this, write articles about it, and do what I can to try to make people aware of what's happening and some suggestions based on my experience that might be useful for them to do something about it.
Well, Jim, that's where I met you the first time was when I was working as a county commissioner and invited you to come up and testify on the fact that the wolf introduction had been done totally illegally. And J.D., you as a young movie producer at 19 years old, created a film called Crying Wolf that was widely recognized as being a really solid introduction to the wolf issue. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely, Dan. That's how I met you. That's how I met Jim. Jim was one of my best interviewees in the film, and it was a project that just kind of naturally came to me because as a kid, teenager, I wanted to get into film, and I wanted to pick my first project. And I think I was 18 when I started, and I got a camera, got a mic, started interviewing people, trying to learn about the issue. And I grew up on a ranch in southwestern Montana in the Big Hole Valley, and we were surrounded by wolves everywhere. And because we were centrally located really between Glacier and Yellowstone and then central Idaho where they let some wolves loose. And so it was really a corridor there. In fact, in 1 year, the federal trapper took out 49 wolves out of our valley alone. Now, when you compare that to the original goal of having 78 to 100 in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and then within it was 10 or 15 years of that, they're annihilating 50 of them in one valley in one state in the region. They clearly had a problem there. But Crying Wolf, Exposing the Wolf Reintroduction to Yellowstone National Park was the name of that project, and I talked about a lot of things or I should say, I interviewed Jim, and he talked about a lot of the points that he just made about the money being stolen. That was kind of the climax of the film and the investigation, and I ended up putting that film online for free because I didn't have any connections. I'm a self-taught filmmaker, and it was such a hot button issue at the time that within 3 months it had over 100,000 views. And I had been contacted by people all over the world, all over the United States. It was really the first time that this story had been told on that kind of level in a film. And so it really kind of went viral in a small way, and the circles of people who were affected by it were contacting me saying, thank you so much for putting this together. I have something to show my friends out east so they can finally understand what's happening with the wolves out here. And I think most surprising was the people who lived in Europe that I was contacted by. I was contacted by people in France and Germany and Sweden. And in each of those countries, in the last few years, there's been a huge wolf problem. The same thing is going on in those states, countries rather. And as a point of news, an update kind of, so I put my film online, and it was originally on a website called Vimeo, which is not as popular as YouTube. And so I put it on YouTube, and within just a couple months, I had 30, 40,000 views on it. And I just went to put my new film up on my YouTube channel about a month or two ago, and YouTube shut my channel down. They sent me an email. They said, hey, we're shutting your channel down. And they gave me a bunch of vague reasons about violating some kind of term. On my own all my own content. And so I appealed the decision, and they reopened my channel, and then within 2 days they had me permanently terminated. So my YouTube channel just got completely wiped out.
Wow, that's an interesting fact there, and the fact that you've got another film out, and we'll talk about that a little later in the discussion, but another film called Blue that delves more into the Agenda 21 issue and how all these different programs are being used through so-called sustainability and protecting the environment to shut down the environment to average citizens and to turn our country really into a, let's say, a federally managed and eventually a UN-managed ecosystem. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. One thing I wanted to ask Jim to touch base with a little bit was the various categories of public land designations and how they're to be used and how those have been changed over the last 20 years or so.
Well, we've got some basic legislation that it was passed in the 1970s and the 1980s, talking about declaring wildernesses on government land, and that's a story all its own for lands that have been set aside and closed to logging and closed to any access for all practical purposes. And then we've got the designations of not a designation, but all of the government easement activity with the Nature Conservancy, where they fund the Nature Conservancy in a lot of instances, and the Nature Conservancy uses its donations to buy easements on places that will stop development up in the valley or beyond this point, to stop cattle or logging activities. And also the Nature Conservancy will buy land that, this is illegal, but the federal government bureaucrats say that, we don't have enough money this year and we can't get money next year, but we want to buy the Jim Beers Ranch over there or the Dan Happel farm over here. So the Nature Conservancy goes in and takes an option on it, or in fact purchases it outright, holds it for a year or two, and then resells it. And the federal government makes it into a refuge or an addition to a national forest or a park or whatever. In addition to all the stuff you see going on every year for a new national park here and a new national monument there, and 3 more refuges over here, and that whole thing marching there. And then in addition to that, laws like the Endangered Species Act in particular started a very, very pernicious, illegal, evil, unconstitutional practice in our government, where the federal bureaucrats can list a species as endangered. Let's just say spotted owls or wolverines. And they say that this endangered species will need all of this land, and they'll just draw a big spot on the map. It may be a state map, it may be a map of the western states, it may be a map of the Rocky Mountains or of the southeastern United States or the Mississippi drainage, and they'll make it all red over here and all yellow over there, and they'll say, this red stuff over here, that's critical habitat. You people that live in there can no longer get rid of any brush on your property. You can no longer cut pine trees that are over 40 years old because they have woodpecker holes in them. And you cannot do other things. You cannot graze cattle in there anymore. And by making this declaration and calling it critical habitat, they take from the private landowner or the person that has been leasing government land for generations to graze cattle or cut timber, they take that away from them without even any compensation. So that, an example of that was a warbler out down near Austin, Texas, where they declared a whole bunch of brushy land northwest of Austin. They said that this was warbler critical habitat, and you people can no longer clear any brush on there. And people said, well, I was going to build houses on there when my kids came time to go to college because I figured that was how I'd finance them. That was just too bad. You just could not do it. So there's been a whole range of things that have been developing under regulations written by the bureaucrats under these laws, and the habit of, and this is very widespread nowadays, the kind of bureaucrats that are in the federal government in these agencies are just soulmates of these radical groups like the Defenders of Wildlife, the Animal Welfare Institute, Humane Society, Natural Resources Defense Council, Center for Biological Diversity, Earth First, like you mentioned. And they plan with them and have meetings with them, many of which they do not record. They go to have lunch or they have meetings after hours at work. They call them in and they sit down and they talk about the way certain people like you or I are trying to fight them and trying to cause them trouble here, and how to do away with that by changing the regulations, or more often going into court. And they discuss how if we go into court and sue on the basis of the way this thing is worded, I think if we take that into a court in the District of Columbia or out in San Francisco, that we'll get a judge that'll say you're right. That just like a judge did recently about the wolverine, the judge said that the federal government should look at listing the wolverine based on global warming expectations in the future. So the thing has just taken on such absurd tones. You and I, who know about wolverines or know about owls and know about the woodlands and what's there and the wolves' effect on elk and moose and everything, we see these things and we kind of laugh about them. And you know, for years we were, they'll never get away with that. And they do get away with it. And they get away with it. They're like a child that's been sticking up 7-Elevens or something. They started out by stealing lunch money in grade school, and then they were beating up other kids for their allowances in high school. And the next thing you know, they're picked up for sticking up a 7-Eleven. These bureaucrats have never been punished for anything. Just going all the way back to the 1990s when they publicly stole that money, were exposed for stealing it before a congressional hearing, and everybody not only went scot-free, the money that they stole and used for these things that weren't authorized, the money was never replaced. The wolves were never gotten rid of. And now here we are today with all of them acting as though they're sort of apostles sent out under the Acts of the Apostles to do the Lord's work here for the environment, the ecosystem, the animals, the wolves, and every other one of these crazy things that they could come up with, as if they were sort of religious motives, you might say. So nobody should ever think of punishing them, because look at that young lady there in the uniform of the government petting the little wolf puppy. Now, who could be against any of this? That's all mixed up together.
And Jim, as you well know, too, a lot of these government agents that are, let's say, working for wildlife services will ultimately end up working with NRDC or one of these other groups. It's kind of a revolving door between the environmental NGOs and the federal agencies. They work together, they play together, they...
Well, you know, Dan, it isn't just the federal agencies and these radical groups. I was just reading 2 days ago where the guy that's been hired to be the Oregon Wolf Commission chairman, and they've got pictures of him there in his nice jacket and nice tie and shaking hands with all these radical people. He was the National Park Service superintendent when they put the wolves in there. And he spent the remainder of his career talking about, oh, wolves are good, they're bringing back the willows and the aspen, and the beaver are all over the place again, and we've got wildflowers everywhere, and there's still a lot of elk and moose out there. You just don't see them because they stay back in the hills over there. Big fan of putting out wild buffalo, free-roaming buffalo, and rewilding. So they go from the federal government and a great big high-paying job with a high-paying retirement, even to a state job, you know, because the governor is, you know, of the party that wants that kind of gravitas for this kind of radical stuff that they're doing. So the federal employees, the state employees, and the radicals are, and if you add in the university professors, to be honest with you, that are involved in this, they're all the same. Like, you can just pluck one out and plug them in over here. It's like a one size fits all battery for your flashlight. You just pick out one, put it in there, and they all do the same.
I've kind of seen that I'm on a BLM RAC, and a lot of the folks that are appointed to that RAC, which is Resource Advisory Council, are university professors or people that have worked in the various agencies, and they'll end up being appointed to that rack. And quite honestly, people like me are kind of an anomaly in that particular kind of a category, because we're standing up for property rights, and once they find out where we stand, I guarantee you we won't be reappointed. J.D., would you like to talk a little bit about the anti-humanist agenda that you discovered through the radical environmental interests when you were doing the movie Blue? That was a fantastic movie, and I do recommend that everyone go to the movie site. I think you're also showing that free on YouTube and in Vimeo. And
remember the YouTube channel shut down?
Yeah,
not YouTube anymore. That was permanently deleted by YouTube without reason, without rhyme. They didn't tell me. I asked, but so a little bit of background. After I did Crying Wolf, I started traveling all across the Western United States showing the film, mostly from requests. People had seen it online, like, please bring it to my community. We'll make an event out of it. And so I had travel. I had never public spoken before at the time, and so I had to figure that out. But anyway, so I travel around. I started speaking about the issue. Kind of started learning that, hey, if I'm gonna try to sell this film and make a living doing this, I've got to become an ambassador for the cause, and I've got to become an advocate. And so I was learning everything I could about it, and talking to all of these old timers who had come to some of the showings was just, I learned so much from these people who had lived there for generations on the land and had seen it, before the government turned into this massive green machine. And so anyways, people started telling me, hey, JD, you got to make another movie. And, you got to talk about this issue. You got to talk about that issue. And so, and then I had people say, hey, have you heard of Agenda 21? And I'm like, what? What's that? In fact, my first radio show I was on, I think it was actually a podcast. And somebody asked me that. They're like, so would you say this is a part of Agenda 21? And I'm like, what's that? And I honestly had never heard of it. But as it was explained to me, it started making so much sense. And so it really started piecing things together for me, because I had listened to their, the environmentalist podcast. I had watched everything they put out. I had really consumed a lot of their content, tried to figure out what they were all about. And I listened to this one podcast by a particular environmentalist who's involved somewhat in Earth First, but not a member, I don't believe. I don't remember the name of her group off the top of my head, but she started talking about what she called the 3 C's. C as in core, and carnivore, and corridor. So she went on to explain how, they have to start creating more and more core wilderness areas that Jim alluded to. Legal definition, it means no human activity on this land forever because of, the name of the planet and preservation, and then whatever else excuse they can come up with for setting the land aside for forever without humans touching it. So they want to create more of these, and then they need to create corridors between them all, so that the squirrels and the rabbits and whatever can migrate around. Well, then they need carnivores. And this one was really interesting to me, coming from the wolf issue, because carnivores, especially the wolf, they are the keystone predator. They dominate the food chain, and they travel and spread all over the place, especially the wolf. They're uncontainable. They're unstoppable. And so, once wolves that they put in Yellowstone start showing up in Oregon and Washington and North Dakota and Colorado, they go, oh my word, the wolves are going everywhere. They need safe passageways so they don't have to cross a road, so that they don't have to cross a farm. And then, like Jim talked about earlier, it's like, okay, we need your land, we need their land, we need theirs, we're going to add it to here. And pretty soon you have no land left that's productive at all. And you start losing access to your timber resources, which I documented in Blue. You start losing access to your mining resources, which is also documented in Blue. Blue beats green. If you search on Vimeo for Blue beats green, you can watch the film in its entirety. I'm trying to reach as many people as I can with this message at this point. And it all starts making sense. And then if you can't access your resources, you can't build your economies in these rural areas. The young people like myself are leaving because there's no opportunity there. I think the fastest growing demographic is like 55 to 65. there's just not economic opportunity anymore in a state that's killed 50,000 jobs in the timber industry in the last 10 or 20 years. Okay. And so pretty soon after that, what the end goal of Agenda 21, if you really start peeling it back, is to reduce the world's population by, 80 to 90%. Well, one of the cleanest and easiest ways to do that is by taking the resources of the world and putting them off limits to human beings. And if we're unable to cultivate resources and extract them from the ground and employ people with good jobs and create things and grow food and everything else, the world's just not going to be able to support as many people as there are.
Well, that's a terrific discussion, J.D., and we'll break at this point. Kelby, you wanted a few minutes for a break, and then we'll get right back into this discussion.
Thank you, Dan. It won't take that long at all. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you for your contribution towards the RNN News Network. The Republic for the United States of America has been re-inhabited, and you can visit us at republicfortheunitedstates.org. Please go and take a look at the declaration and the information on our homepage there. Again, republicfortheunitedstates.org. We stand in place and holding seats for the people to come. And we hold calls every night of the week pretty much. On Wednesday night, we need you to participate. We need you to get the information out because this country was founded from the bottom up, and this is what we need to do. We need to re-inhabit the states and the counties at the local level. So we encourage you to come out on Wednesday evenings at the Building the States phone call. And we thank you for your support. Mr. Happel, I yield.
Thank you, Kelby. Now, this is a good point, I guess, to, Jim, have you step in and maybe talk about the transfer of the rural areas, the public land in those rural areas, into closed trails, public lands that are supposedly set aside for public use end up being off limits for any kind of motor vehicles, and how they have used that to change the dynamic of the rural communities.
Well, you got to think back to the 1970s and all of those laws that they got passed and what's happened since then with laws and regulations. We've got presidents now, George Bush, Obama, all making marine sanctuaries and adding to wildernesses and closing down areas where energy can be developed. It's on federal land. No fracking, no digging for coal over there, none of this. Everything getting closed down everywhere. And then you add to that the fact that the federal workforce involved in these agencies and these departments, Interior and Ag especially, have been hiring since the 1970s more and more people that have no natural resource management background. They are simply oriented fervently and religiously to saving resources. Although they use that word sustainable all the time, the UN and the federal government here in the United States, what they do is anything but sustainable. Sustainable means that you cut trees in a way that you can cut them at a certain rate over a large area forever. And by rotating, when you cut these trees, different species or selective cutting or certain clear cuts, you keep certain habitats there for wildlife and for grazing cattle, and you do that in a sustainable way that'll go on for centuries. What they believe in, all of these new employees, and are just radical about, is that we should save more and close more. If we can't get a wilderness here, we'll say that this is causing erosion, we've got to close all the trails. And then in Washington, eventually the head of the agency will pass new regulations that henceforth the roads that used to be like this that people use should be closed right now because we want to save the animals and we blah, 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 blah. And it's just a big drive for that as they collude with, and they're all aware of this, as they work with these organizations from the cities that don't want any more people in the small towns. So they want to fight a new road that goes into your old town or your valley. Or they want to stop sewage development. And they work with Indian tribes on this. even in areas way off the reservation, because the tribes have a stake in not having development around there, and they support all of these things. And you've got university professors that understand this, so they no longer teach management of natural resources. Now they teach global climate change and the effects on El Nino and the need for rewilding and bringing back free-roaming buffalo, because if we get free-roaming buffalo, blah, 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 because they know they'll get grant money for that. They know that students will come in and take those classes because they can get jobs with the federal government if they say, oh, I've got 4 classes in global warming as well as managing El Nino for future bat populations in the United States, or some other such crazy insignificant thing, or link up that doesn't make drive for more and more. And then we got to step back and think about the politics of it. Doing that, most of these people, especially the young ones in the cities, love this stuff. I'll vote for you, Dan, if you'll back more marine sanctuaries and you're all for closing down those areas out there to hunting and trapping and logging and grazing and the raping of the land, blah, 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 because it doesn't bother me. It just makes me feel good that, gee, I might go out there sometime and might hear a wolf. And my kids will be able to know that we finally turned the United States or North America around to what it was like before Columbus and all those rotten, no good Europeans came here. Because when the Indians lived here in a very primitive lifestyle, this was the Garden of Eden. That somehow getting back to that, which is absolutely impossible, whether anybody wants to admit it or not, is what it's all about. So they're pleased, and they get higher grades in the government. They get better retirements. The university professors get more tenure and more graduate students, and the radicals get more money. Beating the bushes about, oh my gosh, they're gonna trap red wolves in North Carolina and kill the puppies of hybrids. It's just awful. All of that stuff. People, little old ladies are going to write them a check, and young girls are going to say to their teacher in biology class in high school, oh, teacher, I want to be a park ranger when I grow up, because somehow the mystique of all of this sounds almost like a vocation to be a nun or to be a brother in a monastery.
It is a religion, Jim.
Exactly.
And,
yeah.
It is environmentalism has turned from being an occupation to a religion. And I'm going to mention an encounter that I had with NRDC. When I was a county commissioner, I had an opportunity to go to the Department of Livestock. They were having a hearing at the Department of Livestock on the new Farm Bill and how they were going to try to include in that new Farm Bill the reimbursement to livestock owners who had lost livestock, and how they were also going to be using part of the Farm Bill to create a permanent fund that they could use for the experiment of dealing with large predators. Well, I went to the meeting, and there was a gentleman at the far end of the table that was pretty much leading the whole meeting. And he was talking about how they needed, all the farmers and ranchers and everybody needed to support this Farm Bill. And I didn't know who he was. I thought maybe he was an employee of the Department of Livestock. But in any case, he kept talking about using non-lethal means of taking care of the wolf issue. And I mentioned to him, I said, well, non-lethal might be good in some cases, but we need lethal controls to take care of some of these wolf populations as well. And he just about had a fit. Well, it turned out the guy running the meeting was a lawyer by the name of Bob Harrison, was from Virginia, and he was representing the NRDC. And they were trying to get $20 million put into the Farm Bill so that the taxpayers would end up paying for all these, not only the predation losses, but also the experimentation that NRDC and other groups would be doing to try to create non-lethal control of wolves. Well, bottom line is that when these wolves were introduced to the park, Defenders of Wildlife and NRDC had both agreed to pay for any of the losses that were sustained by ranchers in the area for any livestock, and they quit doing that. And when I mentioned that they had the responsibility, not the taxpayers, to pay for those predation losses, the lawyer, Bob Harrison, said, well, we don't have that kind of money. And I had downloaded that morning the financial statement of the Natural Resource Defense Council and the latest fundraiser that they had. And over a period of 2 years, they had raised $500 million to be used to try to get the wolves relisted, not delisted, relisted. And they had that kind of money that they had brought in. And it's like you said, Jim, they can put an envelope out in New York City and say, oh, these poor wolves, we've got to do something to take care of them. And they get all kinds of money from cities. And yet these people don't live in the country. They don't see what's going on in our areas. They have no right to control our livestock industry through their manipulations. And so anyway, that's my own personal observation. I saw it firsthand, and it's amazing because these guys, the foxes, have been put in charge of the hen house.
Well, you know, it's not just the bureaucrats and these radicals either, and the professors. It's the politicians in Washington. They get votes out of that. These groups go in there and give them money, lobbying money. And these groups are in there with their staff people, these young girls and boys that work for them, and they are literally girls and boys that are working for these congressmen and senators, and they're very sympathetic to all of this. But the congressman or the senator gets money from it, and they get publicity. Here's old Senator Snodgrass cutting the new ribbon at the new refuge, you know, the Jim Beers Memorial National Monument or whatever. It's all about getting political support and getting reelected and staying in power, as well as getting money and media attention. Because I mean, everybody loves a media star, and the more these guys and gals that are politicians get their pictures in the paper, the bigger a deal they are with their neighbors and their people, and everybody, you know, claps for them and has parades for them every time they come home. So that's all wrapped up in this stuff too, as we talk about where does it come from, what's causing this, what can we do about it. It's all kind of insidious, the whole big package, to be honest with you.
Well, I think all of us remember when, or at least many of us remember when Clinton and Gore went to the Blue Ridge Mountains, and they supposedly took these canoes down this beautiful, pristine waterway that they were in the process of restoring. And the story is that they had 15 helicopters belching out diesel as they were burning to get them to this location. It took all of about 5 minutes, and they were practically carried to the location where they did their little photo op. It took about 5 minutes for the photo op, and they figured by the time they got through the transportation and all of the things that went with that it would have been about 10 years of energy usage for the average American.
Crazy.
Yeah, it is.
So,
JD, would you like to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on in California right now, about the water issues and some of the issues that were brought out in your film Blue? I thought that was tremendous. The gentleman there in, I think it was Southern Oregon or Northern California, that was the pilot, had the radio station there.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. There's so many different issues we could talk about. Yeah, the water one was huge. You know, there's an effort right now in this country from the top level down, and all of the cronies that we've talked about, the crowd, the Save the Planet radicals, like Jim said, they're all cookie cutters. They're one and the same. Some of them are in the Fish and Wildlife Service. Some of them are, in Earth First. Some of them are professors at the school. But whatever, they're trying to remove dams from the rivers. And Northern California is one of their most targeted areas. Southern Oregon, and they want to, in the name of saving the fish, and what's going on there is people are losing their water resources, the water they used to irrigate with, the water that made the landscape look beautiful, and that they built their house next to is gone now. And it's all in the name of saving fish, or letting the salmon swim up the river further. And what's interesting is in certain places in California, I believe it was in Siskiyou County, in the river there, if you read the journals, this is what they were telling me, you read the journals of some people who came there early on, and the water was so dirty because of the volcanic nature of the soil that settlers and what have you never saw salmon in the river. It wasn't until they built some of these dams that the sediment was allowed to kind of build up into the bottom of the reservoir and stopped flowing down the stream. And then with a regulated flow, it created a much cleaner river, and so the salmon actually swam up the thing. Okay, but now you have these environmentalists come along and say, oh, the dams are bad. We got to let the salmon swim. They got to swim up the river. And so they're just going to blow them up. And they are blowing up these dams. And a side effect of that is they're really ruining ecosystems, just because the water that rushes out of there, number one, the way it reverts back to how it used to be, dirtier river, number two. But then another big one is the sediments that have the chemicals and the volcanic stuff that's accumulated in the bottom of these reservoirs for so long gets released everywhere. Causes a huge problem, right? But maybe it's not really a problem, because guess who gets to clean it up, right? And that's where it gets really interesting, because the people who want the money, all the money that's involved in projects like this, which are huge, blowing up these dams, are the same people who will get to clean up the rivers and everything for who knows how many years afterwards. And so, again, it's all about this money, it's all about this control, it's all about this power. What I would like to do is spend the last few minutes brainstorming with you guys, for our listeners who say, look, I get it, there's problems, we get it, the government is too big, these environmentalists have too much power. Jim, what are some ways? I remember talking to you about this a few times. What are some ways that people can get involved, or some solutions that they can aim for?
Well, I'm dealing with that right now as I write a talk I'm going to give a week or so in Spokane, Washington, to a bunch of people who want me to talk about tools to deal with the threats that the federal government is presenting to rural America. And you've got to kind of look at the current political environment, because if you look back to 1776, when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they were at their wits' end about abuses from London. In other words, they were saying, and they wrote down that, we can't keep quartering troops in our houses. They can't keep taxing us like they're doing. They should not be able to come in here and take our guns away from us and our arsenals. And we've either got to go fight them or try to resolve it. And when you say you want to resolve it, just like when they said they wanted to go to war about it, there's going to be a bunch of people like the loyalists that are going to tell you, oh, I think the federal government ought to run all this stuff, and I think it's a really good deal. Those are the people in the cities right now, a lot of them. And there's going to be, like there is in every confrontation, there's going to be a lot of people that just hide under their beds and hope that it won't affect them too much, and get over pretty quick. And then you got people that are going to have to sit down and try to fight it. In other words, and I don't mean fight it with arms or anything. I mean sit down and say, how do we do this? Where do we go? We've got local governments, we've got county commissioners, and we've got sheriffs. And we've got authority of theirs that's been whittled away, and some of the sheriffs are gone because the counties could no longer even afford to have them because of what the federal government did to the county revenue. We've got state governments that have just gone further and further afield. States originally were supposed to protect all of our local communities, our counties, and provide for them and protect us and let us have our way of life in Montana and our way of life in Missouri or in Texas, and abide by certain things in the Constitution. But other than that, pretty much let the states have their taxation levels and everything else, and the federal government more concentrated on defense, national defense, and foreign relations and the things to keep the country strong, to keep the states strong, to keep the local government strong, to keep the local communities and the family strong. That's you and me. So we've got to work with the local government people. We've got to campaign with them. We've got to get rid of bad ones and elect good ones. We've got to challenge our state fish and wildlife agencies and other agencies and our governor and our legislators to once again stand up for our state and our values in our state and not be part of these federal agendas. And with all of that on our side, you've got to approach the impacts in your state and you got to stand up to them. You can't buy into this, oh, look, let's all get along. We've all been arguing too long. Let's just all stop in place and we'll all sing around the campfire for a year or two until they can, once again get started and take right off from where they were. But to actually take it on head on and start trying to reverse allowing the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the closure of federal lands, the treatment of federal lands like they aren't really in the state, which is more and more what people think. Oh, that's a national forest. Nobody can do anything there except the federal government. That's not true. Oh, that's a national wildlife refuge. That's a national park. With the exception of one or two national parks like Washington, D.C. and Yellowstone, all the parks are land owned by the federal government in the state and subject to state authorities. But more and more the state says, oh, we can't do anything. That's the BLM land. Oh, we can't do anything. The forest superintendent said this, or the BLM enforcing thugs are out here, and they say that. We got to stand up to those people in a unified way. We can't let certain ranchers go out on a limb and just sit back and watch the federal government saw the limb off behind them. We've got to stand up.
We've seen that recently, guys, and we've seen the death of Levon Finnegan and some of the ranchers that have actually gotten to the point where they say, we're going to stand our ground. We're not going to give any more ground because we're the last ones here. And I guess that'll lead into future shows that we're going to be doing on the American Lands Council and some of the issues about turning federal land back to the states where it can be more productively used, where it can be more beneficially used for the citizens of the state. But, we've seen I see a sea change attitude in the last 2 years, and I believe that America is waking up, and I believe just the fact that we're doing radio shows like this tells me that we are finally starting to make a dent in the control mechanism that has become the U.S. federal government. And the only thing that we can do to promote that further and to foster that is, like you said, Jim, get better local and state elected officials, because the federal officials are pretty much out of control.
Yeah, they're pretty much out of our reach for now, but we can get at them in a few years if we can get good state and local officials in and stand up for our rights.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And like JD was saying about his YouTube, Vimeo and YouTube shutting them down and just dropping them.
Isn't that
amazing? Same thing happened to me. I tried a blog site after I had 2 websites destroyed by viruses. I had a blog site and I had it for about a month. That I was trying to put all of my stuff that I write on there. I've written about 1,700 articles since I retired. And one day I was just not on there anymore, and I wrote them. They never answered me. They had just dropped me. And it was some of these radical people that work there or got them to do that. So we've all got kind of a high benchmark to get over and a lot of problems to face, but we can't afford to stop. We gotta keep going with them.
Well, and something that this internet that we've got right now is a fantastic tool to be able to spread the word of liberty and freedom. And I think that the fact that they are so hard trying to shut down the internet and shut down our access to this is a very good indication of why we need to make sure that they don't do that, that we keep the internet open. We've gotten so much more information available to the average citizen today than at any time in the past, and that's what has helped to win this war against tyranny. And J.D., young people like yourself that are making these fantastic films, and incidentally, I really recommend that people go to his websites and take a look at the films that he's produced. These things, this young man has a future that will be incredible, but we need to stand up and get out and support people like him, and we need to do it with our dollars, because you cannot film and make movies like he's made without having financial support. And so it's really important that the people that are the patriots in this country need to realize that in a year or two, if we don't do anything and we don't put a little of our own money and blood, sweat, and tears into these efforts, we won't have the right to do that, and we'll lose every dime we've got anyway. J.D., would you like to talk about that a little?
Yeah, we just got to keep doing what we can do, and I'm encouraged by how we can reach people, and it's been encouraging to me and humbling at the same time. When I run across people, and I get emails from people who have changed their direction based off of something they saw that I did. I mean, even just in the last month or so, I've had several thousand views on my videos online. I encourage listeners to check them out. But we got to get the truth out there, and we can't give up, like Jim said. And I think there is a shift where Americans are starting to wake up and see these issues in their real light, and be concerned that freedom is going away in many places. And so, that's encouraging too. As I've traveled around, I've met so many people who have woken up and who are making a big difference in their community.
Well, I think that's really important too, to get young people to run for public office, to get involved, to run for school boards, to be involved in their local community actions, and understand that they're the last line between liberty and tyranny, and if they don't stand and do the right things, we aren't going to have a country in another generation or two. And it's going to be very important that we stand up for our rights. And J.D., you've got a young friend from over around Grass Range that's been in contact with me about doing exactly that. And I believe he's running for county commission over there.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think, we are making headway, whether we realize it or not. And the fact that so many of the powers that be are in such a panic to shut everything we're doing down tells me that we're being effective, and we need to not only continue to do what we're doing, but we need to do more. And people like J.D. that have the ability to make these powerful films, and people with the dedication of Jim Bierce that are willing to go out and travel the country and talk to people all over the land on issues about how our government is taking too much control of our local communities. You guys need our undying support and our very definitely our utmost respect, and I thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Dan. It was great of you to have us on the show, or at least for me. It's a real good experience.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Well, let's, Kelby, we're going to turn the mic over to you, and I want to thank our guests again, and please go to their websites, and please take a look at our page that we sent out with this telecast, and it does have information, including where you can view the videos. And there are several videos as well of Jim Beers doing projects around the country. And these guys are true American patriots, and we need to do everything in our power to make sure that their voice is heard. So with that being said, Kelby, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Dan Happel. JD, one more time, your website, please.
Hey, so go check me out on Vimeo. So if you look for me on Vimeo, my username is JD King, and the films are Crying Wolf and Blue Beats Green.
All right, JD, and how about you, Mr. Beers?
I don't have a website. People that want to receive things that I will write in the future or want to receive copies of something I wrote in the last 15 years can contact me at Jim Beers, JIMBEERS, the number 7 at Comcast.net.
Thank you, gentlemen. That's going to conclude our call for this week. Again, we are here every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific with the Connecting the Dots show with Mr. Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you in 7 days. Bye-bye.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again.